And I have some musical examples to illustrate some of my points. Please do ask questions as I go along. I'll be very glad to do my best to answer them. Don't hold them till the end, just let's be somewhat informal. I have a suggested listening list. You're welcome to take one. By way of easing into this, I think that we'll do it. Hi, come on in. Please make yourself comfortable. We're working off a smaller than usual display here, so you might want to get in the line of fire for that. Okay, I think we'll jump into our first composer, Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. Probably a familiar name. I'm kind of pronouncing it German style, Bach. He was, some would say, the composer from which all other Western music since the 1700s springs. The debt owed by many composers to Johann Sebastian Bach is considerable. Briefly, he lived in an era of apprenticeship. He lived from 1685 to 1750, and that was pre-modern world. He was born into and grew up in a very devout Lutheran world, German Lutheran world, after the Reformation. He grew up with pretty strong religious principles. That was in the communities in which he lived. And he lived in the era before the artist was forgiven for being eccentric or kind of nutty or different or a free spirit. He was a solid citizen who worked at his phenomenal output, nevertheless with the mindset of a craftsman and an employee of the local church and nobility. He would not have received a huge amount of press or media coverage. There really was no such thing in those days. And he lived in a very devout world. So here's the first example. This is one of his works based on the Gospel of Matthew, the Saint Matthew Passion. I chose this one. It's very lovely, and it gives you some idea of the seriousness of and then the choir comes in. So just a little taste. Is that a familiar music to somebody? May or may not be. The St. Matthew Passion focuses on the final days in the life of Jesus as written in the New Testament scripture. This particular segment in English is named In Deepest Woe, in German Im tiefsten Not. In German, it comes out a little more in direst emergency. So it depends how you wish to translate it. But anyway, a little bit of a taste of the serious Lutheran side of Bach. He lived and worked in several Middle German towns. I've got a photo. This is the church in Leipzig, Germany. During the years of the East German Republic, it was in East Germany, so it was it was not inaccessible to scholars, but it was a little tougher to get there. You can see the elegant and somewhat ornate, but somewhat simpler Protestant style is contrasted to the more ornate Catholic churches you might see in farther south in Germany and down into Italy. But it is a lovely church, still there, they have a pastor, they have an organist, it's still going. And Bach would have reigned supreme there, not as the pastor, but as the director of music. This is the inside of the church, and you can see that it's also lovely, but somewhat simple. I'd say moderately simple. And the congregants would sit in these rows, not as most American churches do, where we face the center, but facing each other. Sometimes you'll see this in some Catholic and Episcopal church, maybe Lutheran churches, I don't know. Bach would have sat at the organ and played the organ up here. These are the organ pipes, and he would have sat here and led the choir from the organ and performed from the organ. He was one of Europe's greatest organists. He was known throughout Germany as a master player of this rather complicated instrument and improviser. In those days, a church musician of his and his position would be expected to be active all Sunday long. Lutheran services of his era went all day. It wasn't just 11 to noon, or is it my home church 10 to 11? With coffee hour, of course, extends it. But no, it was one went for hours and hours of worship, and Bach would be at the organ the entire day, segueing from one section into the next, improvising brilliantly and musically illustrating what was going on. Some of the music he did prepare ahead of time, his cantatas. It's from the Italian word to sing, cantare. Cantata means it would be a work that illustrated the lectionary. Are you familiar with the word lectionary? In many Protestant, both Protestant and Catholic churches, certain parts of Scripture are covered cyclically throughout the year, sometimes a 3-year cycle, sometimes a 1-year cycle, and Bach would set the Scripture to music. His main job, in fact, in life was to set Scripture to music, to make the Word of God known through music to the congregation. He did write music. I'll play you an example that was secular in nature and very lovely. In all of his compositions that are handwritten by him, he'll usually inscribe something in praise of God or to the glory of God, something to that effect. This is kind of a caricature of Bach at the organ. It's kind of fun, if you can. It looks like it might be from New Yorker or one of those types of. And, this is one of his manuscripts that if you can see it closely, it's very lovely. He had the most beautiful handwriting, and he turned out, people still scratch their heads, how he turned out all this music. Not only its quality aside, we simply don't know how he turned out so much quality of music. Because he was directing the choir, he was in charge of a bunch of boys in the choir. He was something of an administrator. He had to manage a budget. He wasn't always in artistic paradise. He had, a lot to do. So you can see, not only did he had a very lovely hand that gives some of the flowing features of his music. Here's a more cheerful example. This has some kind of that bouncy Baroque, what would you call it? Regularity, yeah. It's nice, you kind of. I agree with you. I'm going to go. Yeah. Is that better? I think that's all we'll cover with Bach. Any questions? Yes, sir.
If you touch on the well-tempered clavier and how
sure.
he brought into the ability for one keyboard to play in all the keys.
You're absolutely correct. Good question. This is me playing a movement from the well-tempered clavichord. And then I'll answer your question. Thanks, Bill. This is a fugue, F-U-G-U-E, and fugue is a Baroque term having to do with counterpoint, which is a longish word, contrapunctus in Latin. The art of taking one line and then another line very much like it, melody, and another one, and making them sound good altogether as they go along. They make sense in a linear way, and they make sense horizontally. Yes, a round is a simpler form of a fugue, very much so, yeah. Frere Jacques or... So the well-tempered clavier contains in 24 keys a prelude and fugue in each key. One prelude in C major, prelude, fugue in C major, prelude in C minor, fugue in C minor. Bach set himself the challenge of going C major, C minor, that's one key on the piano, up one black note, C sharp major, C sharp minor, D major, D minor, and so forth. There are 12 notes in the chromatic scale on the piano, and each of the 12 he did in a major and minor key. If you've seen a piano keyboard, you can picture that, although on other instruments you can play up the chromatic scale. And then what the gentleman here was pointing to was it has to do with tuning, and I'm not sure I have the mathematical background to explain clearly how that works, but there were different tunings. You ever had a piano tuner come to your home? Or, they tune so that if you move from C to C sharp to D to E flat to E, that you're going to be in each key in perfect tune. In the old days, they didn't do it that way, for reasons that are a little cumbersome to explain, but the old church organs and the string players in the 1600s, 1500s would play in something called mean tuning. And what that meant was that they would sound great in certain keys, such as C major, D major, E major, A major, a limited number of keys, and the composers would stick to those tonalities. Yeah. If you've heard a mean-tuned instrument to our modern ears, it sounds kind of like grandma's piano that's been, slipping out of tune, at least my grandmother's. So tuners of Bach's time cooked up a system where all the keys, you could write a piece in any key and transfer it to any other key, and it would sound well. So he has a prelude and fugue in F sharp major, which is nearly all the black keys on the piano. No violinist in that era would play a piece in that key. So your question points to some of Bach. Bach did have kind of a fascination with order, with numbers. It was an era before the Enlightenment, before the American Revolution, before the French Revolution. The world was considered to be orderly, at least by the educated class, by the church, and his way of approaching music illustrated that. So it's the best answer I can give in a short time, I hope. But I did put the well-tempered clavier on the suggested reading list, listening list. So anyway, I think I'm going to move on to Beethoven, who's our second B, Ludwig van Beethoven. There's a picture of him. 1770, he was born 20 years after Bach died, and he was born in Bonn, Germany. Lived till 1827, age 57. So he was a Rhinelander from Bonn, Germany, and most of his adult life he spent in Vienna after his early 20s, Vienna, Austria. And another picture of him, one of my old classmates. This is kind of Beethoven's "Don't Mess With Me" picture. Yeah. Don't mess with me. Have you heard, Beethoven was an eccentric. Have you heard of any stories about, here's one of his compositions that probably needs no introduction. Is that a familiar one? I think. Yeah. So that's a famous one, da 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 da. That one kind of expresses a man of serious nature, urgency, passion, a man that you didn't mess with. He told a group of nobles in early 1800s Vienna, at one of his concerts where he felt their behavior was a little bit high-handed at times, as nobles will be. He said, "What you are by accident of birth. What I am by myself."
Ego there.
Yeah. Yeah, you're tuning in. There are and will be 1,000 princes. There is only one Beethoven. And I was commenting to the group yesterday, in my day job in the business world, after I did all that music study, I would, as I think many of us probably have, would encounter people we didn't much care for that we worked with. People that were full of themselves, let's say. And I try to distinguish the ones who were, yes, full of themselves, but knew what they were doing and talking about, from those who didn't. And Beethoven certainly could back it up. He would be one of the ones whose ego maybe would be justified. Another quote, "I despise a world which does not feel that music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy." The da-da-da-da from Beethoven. Samuel Morse created Morse code quite a few decades after Beethoven wrote that piece. So he didn't know that ... meant the letter V in Morse code. But during the Second World War, I think Churchill used this music at times on British radio to V for victory, and they were kind of turning the tables on the Germans. Yeah. He was kind of a back at you type of move. So he was quite a strong personality, and sadly, in his late 20s, he began to go deaf after he'd achieved considerable success in the artistic circles of Vienna. He noticed a slow creeping deafness. There wasn't much treatment in those days. He tried different, he bought ear trumpets, or obtained ear trumpets, where you'd stick in your ear and the thing would flare out. He tried those. Oh gosh, cold baths, salt water baths. I mean, there were all sorts of treatments that we would not take seriously today. And his deafness progressed over the next 20 years to the point where by late 40s or so, he was stone deaf. What a terrible fate for a musician. A lady yesterday pointed out correctly that Beethoven he did what he could. He would stick his head up against the piano to try and hear the vibrations, to hear what he could. But he cultivated a kind of inner hearing that enabled him to write down what he was hearing and then sadly not hear it as his life went on.
How old was he when he wrote the Ninth Symphony? Must have been...
He was 50. Well, why don't I play a sample instead of talking? And here it's the Ode to Joy. I think you'll recognize this one. This'll... You've got it.
You know, when he wrote this, for us singers, we call it the Blood on the Chord song, because when he heard the choir and it's all pitched high, very high.
Oh.
You know, what he was feeling. So if you're a singer and you're going...
Oh, he's stretching you. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, so maybe he was impractical. That's... I don't know if you heard, but a lady singer up here has said that, and you've sung in this one. Oh, okay. That it really stretches your voice upwards. Yeah, Beethoven it was part of that ego. I've played many of his piano works, and some of them are tough and awkward, and it's almost as if what I'm imagining in my mind is music, I'm going to get down, and I don't care that much about your comfort. Yeah, he's got that feeling. Or maybe he wants you to struggle. Maybe he wants you to sense some, if you struggle, you project your emotions a little bit more fully. Some performers feel. So,
Now, when you, sorry.
sure. Yeah, no.
Like Bach or organ, or you see some composition that has a symphonics playing the whole music. He wrote parts together or only for one instrument?
Beethoven? Or?
Beethoven and Bach.
Oh, no, they wrote for multiple instruments. Well, both. Beethoven wrote for full orchestra, so you would have 30 different lines going, yeah, or I don't know how many, however many instruments, how many.
Bach did too.
Well, Bach did too, yeah. Mm-hmm.
He wrote it, with the Brandenburg stuff.
Yeah. So they wrote for combinations, yeah. But Bach also wrote beautiful solo violin, one line on the violin, and can make it kind of sound like an orchestra in a way. Does that answer your? Yeah. So they wrote for ensembles of different size. Yeah. I had the question about Beethoven's deafness. Oh, at the premiere of the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven was totally deaf. But for reasons I can't remember, he was supposed to be the conductor. And he did conduct the premiere in 1820-something in Vienna. The theater is still there, I think. But what to do? Well, they had a backup man behind him to really conduct. And Beethoven was, it must have been a little bit pathetic, I don't know. Or maybe touching. He was conducting way off all over the place. And the orchestra had been told to follow the real conductor, who was beating time accurately and able to listen to him.
It's like he was playing a recording in his head.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that when he would bring in this group, sometime he was completely off.
Yes.
It was this group that was supposed to come in.
That's right.
Or the brass was supposed to come in.
Just so,
And,
yeah.
he was all over the place.
He was, yeah.
Very embarrassing.
And I think people realized that this was Beethoven, and he was, by then, one of the heroes, the favorite sons of Vienna. And when the concert was over, he did not know that. Well, he did not know that the piece had concluded. And one of the singers, somebody kindly turned him around so he could see the applauding audience. Yeah.
So he was not reading the music?
He could read the music.
But not to read the music. He should know by the time he's finished this.
Well, he was reading the music and beating what he thought was going on, but the orchestra, and I think it worked for a while, but the orchestra tended to get off the rails a bit. So, yeah.
How wedded was Beethoven to the church versus...
Much less so.
Much less so?
Yeah, Beethoven was Catholic, and he did write several masses. With Bach was quite religiously strict and devout, yeah, and even you could say conservative in a way. Beethoven was more of a free spirit, but he was Catholic and he was a believer. A brief footnote: there's a book I read a few years ago called Beethoven's Hair, H-A-I-R, hair. Strands of Beethoven's hair still exist, had been passed down, and somebody got a hold of them and had modern technology analyze the contents of the hair, and it was found that Beethoven had severe lead poisoning, and he probably had. It's possible, yeah. It either caused it or aggravated it, yeah. They're not quite sure. But they found that he was full of lead, and there was no recognition of what that was or treatment in those days. So. Oh, here's Beethoven in his hometown of Bonn. There's no photo of Beethoven since he died 1827. There were no photographs or daguerreotype. This is a nephew of Beethoven, and I thought it's a photo. Maybe we can see a family resemblance. I don't know. I don't look much like my uncle, so.
He didn't have a very good relationship with his nephew.
He had a terrible relationship. He tried to adopt him, and then I won't get into it now, but Beethoven was a bull in a china shop, but he was a genius bull in a china shop. So it's been said he loved humanity. It was just people that caused him.
He was a narcissist.
One could say that, well, say he's a narcissist in service of art, in service of himself and his art, but other people he was constantly at odds, and you know, human relations were tough for him. So. And yeah, yeah. There's a movie, it came out in '94, named Immortal Beloved, and it stars Gary Oldman. And I would recommend it. It's not very factual, but it's good. Gary Oldman also played Dracula. It's one of the other. But it's a movie that it's like the movie about Mozart in this way, Amadeus. It's not very factual, but it captures some of the spirit, and the soundtrack's very good. Yeah. So you might consider that one. It's on the list. Anything else on Beethoven? The deafness, it still puzzles people how that could be. There are conversation books that people who conversed with Beethoven would write out their questions in longhand, give it to Beethoven, and he would answer them orally. So we have the questions, but we don't have his answers, unfortunately. We know what subjects were brought up, but we don't know what he. There's one by Beethoven. I want to see if you recognize this one. This used to be on the radio quite a bit. Does that ring any bells? That's an adagio. This is a well-known adagio by Beethoven that was, and then we're back to the ninth. Okay, ready for the third Brahms, B, I think? Johannes Brahms. Is that a familiar name? Brahms is maybe a little less. I didn't bring the music to Brahms' Lullaby, but most people, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-da. That's by Brahms. Another of our German friends, this is Brahms in his older years, big beard, a rather gruff fellow. He came in the generation after Beethoven. A lot of composers were intimidated after Beethoven died because Beethoven had done so much. He'd been so comprehensive in his music. What do you do after the Ninth Symphony? I don't know. That's a hard act to follow. And Brahms was in that category of composers that were saying, what do we do now? It took him till age 40 to write a symphony, and it sounds a lot like Beethoven. This sounds kind of like Beethoven.
I love Brahms.
Me too.
Thank you, Bill. We're a team. We go way back. This is a famous timpani portraying fate. So Brahms was clearly paying honor to Beethoven. It's the same key that the Fifth Symphony was in, C minor. And the next piece is similar. The first piano concerto, again, timpani. He liked the drama of the timpani. That's the kettle drums.
He was fairly young.
Yeah. there's a movie I put on there, and now this movie is very fanciful. It's a movie about the composers Robert and his wife, Clara Schumann. They were both composers, both gifted musicians, and they were befriended by Brahms. And there's a movie about the Schumann marriage called Song of Love, and it was made in 1947. Does anyone know who played Clara Schumann?
Catherine Hepburn.
Catherine Hepburn, yeah.
Paul Harvey played.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
And John, what was it?
Brahms was.
Walker.
How did you know that? Yeah.
I don't know.
Robert Walker plays Brahms. And
Wonderful movie.
She can probably tell.
What we have in the movie is that Brahms actually went to study
yes,
with Schumann.
and that's what I downloaded. Just a few words of.
Let me say, Professor Schumann,
That's the scene.
there is no one with whom I would rather study.
Never mind on that. You all came things to work. That's enough. Play something you could. It's Rhapsody.
This is Brahms. This is Brahms playing his music. This is another piece by Brahms. It's a German folk tune. I put it on because the composers went back to folk music and tried to bring it into the concert hall. And they borrowed Hungarian. He liked Hungarian music. Anyone part Hungarian here? Or have you been to Budapest, anyone? Budapest? If you go to the main restaurants with gypsy bands, you'll probably hear that if you stay long enough.
The most impressive work in that vein by Brahms, I think, is the Rondo La Zingarese at the end of the
There is a, yeah, he
absolutely.
You're right. It's from the piano quartet in G minor. It's the final movement, and it goes like the whirlwind. Yeah. This is a little more of a plodding one, but how Brahms hooked up with Hungarian music, I don't know. He's from Hamburg, I meant to mention, the north of Germany. He came to Vienna to make his career and did so. In Vienna, it was the days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Vienna was a cosmopolitan city with Slavic people, from all over the Eastern, Middle Europe and Eastern Europe, and certainly it's only a 4-hour. Today it's a 4-hour train ride from Budapest to Vienna. So Hungarian culture got up there. He loved chicken paprikash, and he loved. Well, I can sense maybe he liked goulash. He liked rich food. I don't know if Brahms was, if side pictures, he had trouble reaching it. And the story goes that he went to see a doctor and was checked out, and the doctor said, as our doctors today will do, Herr Brahms, you must cut down on this, you must cut down on that. He said, no more rich foods, no more chicken paprikash. Please stop. And Brahms said, all right, Herr Doctor. And then Brahms thought to himself, but I'm going over to Frau, Seke's house tonight for my favorite chicken paprikash. He apparently could taste it. And he said, Herr Dr. Billroth was his name. Will you please consider that I did not see you until tomorrow? This is your German Requiem. I think we can... this is from an Old Testament. Wie lieblich ist diese... how lovely is this thy dwelling place. It's from... yeah. German Requiem, yeah. Yeah. There's a warmth, fireside warmth in Brahms. We'll do a bit of Berlioz. Over to France. Next, I've chosen a piece by our fourth B, Hector Berlioz, Summer Evenings, Nuit d'été. This is the name of a 6-song cycle composed by Berlioz about 1840. And there's a loveliness and a lyricism in this music that it distinguishes it a bit from our German predecessors this evening. However, there's a sadness in the music. It's mostly about love, the search for love, how often love is unrequited, unfulfilled. Romantics were much aware of that reality of life. I think the search for love was almost spiritual in nature for romantics. They felt that there was in love, romantic love, a kind of elevation of the spirit that was, way beyond the previous, maybe more practical view of love and marriage. So here we have an excerpt from Summer Evenings, Nuit d'été of Berlioz. This is the Symphonie Fantastique of... He was a master of the big orchestra. I'll give you a little more background, but he composed pieces for as many as 1,000 musicians. I don't know, there were no labor unions yet, or musicians unions. He used it was hard to find venues to perform these pieces. The cathedrals in Paris are rather large. The old Madeleine, Church of the Madeleine. He would situate people around the cathedral and get his hundreds of... But to tell you a little bit about him, Berlioz was French. In Germany, by the time we got to where we were a moment ago with Brahms, there was a kind of seriousness. You mentioned the 4 serious songs of Brahms. Well, yeah, Brahms in general was serious. I heard a famous doctor commenting on the difference between northern German-based ethos and that of the South, Italy and Spain. And of course, this is a generalization that these are never perfectly true, but in Germany there was a kind of seriousness and a longing for a kind of otherworldly spirituality, where, and you hear in the music of Wagner and some of Brahms, but kind of a longing for high experiences and ideals. In Italy, you have the same. In the South, you have a little more here and now orientation. The music is, if I'm happy now. So there is a kind of lightness and happiness in Italian music that you don't find in the Germans. And in Berlioz, he brought some of that lightness of spirit into his music. I mean, I hope to communicate that there's room for everybody at the table. I'm not choosing one over the other. But Berlioz was French. He was a romantic. What's that? A European romantic from the 19th century, the 1800s. Well, they were free spirits. They didn't care much for tradition. They gave it its due. They were breaking out as individuals. What were they doing? Well, they were out in nature a lot. They were very in tune with the trees and the mountains. There are many romantic pieces by Berlioz and others about mountains. They were walkers and hikers. Beethoven, I showed you earlier on, in woods. That was kind of a early romantic thing to do, to be out. I think he was out there because of the peace it gave to his soul, and the fact that his deafness did not penalize him as much. He could take in the nature, and but it was also kind of a early romantic idea that one goes out and communes. And Berlioz.
That Berlioz embodied the program music as opposed to the pure music that composes like.
Good question. A good question for which I thank you. Berlioz believed that music. Well, if we were to have time to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, da 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 da. The whole symphony is about 40 minutes. Now there's no story behind that symphony. You could envision one as you listen to it, and you could and should. It's your entitlement when you hear it. But there are no words to it. It is what it is. It's a piece of music with no externally imposed story. One of Berlioz', as Bill points out, beliefs was that music should tell a story a little more clearly, and for example, one of his most famous works, pardon my French accent, the Symphonie Fantastique, fantastic symphony, fantastic in the sense of kind of unreal or fantastical, whimsical, was not word for word about something, but it was documented by him that this was kind of a psychedelic trip he went on. The story has some charm, and then I'll circuitously answer Bill's question. In the 1820s, Berlioz was at a performance of Shakespeare's Hamlet in English in Paris, and Ophelia was played by this Irish lady, actress, Harriet Smithson. And Berlioz was smitten from the audience with her. And he communicated with her, wrote letters, tried to get to no avail. She didn't know who he was. She thought he was a weirdo, and maybe understandably so. Well, he was in conniptions over this. And his solution, which may or may not have been yours, us guys, was to write a symphony for her and kind of about her. And in the symphony, he's describing a lover on a kind of different states of consciousness, possibly drug-induced, in which the lover, well, there's a witch's Sabbath dance, there's an execution, there's a darkness to all this. It's kind of a weird trip. Well, the symphony was a big hit, and several years later, at its performance, he insisted that he be the one playing the timpani drums. Harriet Smithson was in the audience, and finally, knowing he was the composer, developed some interest in him. And they married and had one child, and then they split up. The reality never quite met up with the fantasy that he'd had. Like other romantics, he was a great diarist and a very good writer. And you can get his take and his writings. I can't remember the name. You can get his take on all this that happened. Great master of the orchestra, thinking big, and expressing great emotions through the way he used the orchestra. He liked woodwinds especially, and he liked their longing and kind of penetrating sounds. So he was a little less structured, a little less tied to the old German ways, and considered more forward-looking, even 20th century composers felt that he was a trailblazer composer. So I have...
The only interesting aspect of this is that the life spans of the composer. Berlioz actually comes before Brahms.
Well, he does, yeah, and he dies considerably before Brahms. And I even thought about making him the third B in this talk. I mean, that would have made some sense. The Fantastic Symphony that I just spoke about, it's a bit out there, even by today's standards, premiered in 1830, which is a long time ago in Paris. And
3 years before Brahms was born.
yes, 3 years before 3 years before Brahms was even born. Yeah. So I don't know if we do this again, Bill. We may switch the order. Yeah. So, please, any other questions, or were some of the musical examples recognizable? I hope. I'll be around a bit. Any other questions?